Recently, we've been able to look at the results for Unearthed Arcana about the Paladin and the Druid. What did we find out?
So this survey again got tons of responses. So first off, thank you to everyone who filled out what I know is a long survey, and it is worth it because this feedback is so informative for how we proceed with the design of each of these classes, each of these subclasses, and the rules and other elements that are present in this playtest. So what we learned with the Druid and the Paladin is super informative. I'll start with the Paladin. The Paladin overall did extremely well in terms of satisfaction. So we saw with the Paladin that every single feature in the class, as well as in the subclass, scored 70% or higher.
Wow.
In the base class, the lowest scoring thing was Divine Smite, and that was at 72%. And for anyone who hasn't been with us for one of these videos before, we consider 70% or higher to be passing. Now, that doesn't mean it's fine as is. We're always iterating and seeing how can we make this more fun, make this better. But it's telling that in the Paladin, that was the floor. And the scores then went up in a number of cases up into the high 80s, close to 90% satisfaction. And so what that, from a quantitative standpoint, tells us is the overall mood about the playtest Paladin was positive. Now, that's only part of the story because the qualitative feedback we get, the written feedback, is critical. And so as we began digging into the feedback and members of the team are continuing to ponder different aspects of it, we see a number of things there. Like one, for example, is many people really loved the addition with Divine Smite of being able to punch smite.
Yes.
But there is a fair amount of resistance to paladins being able to smite on ranged attacks. And actually the resistance is not surprising because it's about class identity. Yeah. And class identity is important to all of us who really love a particular class. And there are a fair number of people who feel like that was a bridge too far, that paladins being that effective at ranged attacks starts making them feel like clerics when compared to another divine spellcaster, and even starting to move into ranger territory. So that's feedback we take seriously because sometimes, even if the math of the game tells us it's okay to do a particular thing, in D&D that's only part of the story because so often it's the narrative that's the most persuasive. It's the identity of something that really captures our imagination. And a lot of commenters on the Paladin bring up that for them, the Paladin, and they're not wrong, has traditionally been a melee class. Also, a lot of great specific feedback about other details in particular features of the class, and a lot of positive response to the redesigned smite spells. And in fact, people were wanting to see the new versions of the smite spells possibly integrated into the class more. And that is something we will be exploring in the next version of the Paladin, of just as we did in the recent Mage playtest, look at giving the Paladin some of these spells as Paladin exclusives, because many people understandably associate those spells just with that class. Now, the Druid was another story, and you and I have talked in another video about we knew that the Druid response was going to be mixed. We knew this for historical reasons. In the playtest Druid, we tested out a different version of Wild Shape that relied on these generalized templates rather than specific beast stat blocks. It's something we tried 10 years ago in D&D Next, received a mixed response, so we didn't go in that direction. But then in the 2021 Player's Handbook survey that we did, we saw quite a few people asking for a design direction like that. So we decided to give it another go. But we knew, because past is prologue, there was a higher than zero chance that it wouldn't be the direction that the majority of Druid fans wanted us to go in. And sure enough, we are seeing that in the feedback to Wildshape, there are basically two camps. There are people who have written in the comments, and I'm looking at the written report here that our staff provided with me, with quotes from fans saying this is their favorite version of Wildshape they've ever seen, paired with people who, in contrast, said they never want this Wildshape to appear in print. And the people in that second group outnumbered the people in the previous group, although it wasn't a huge sort of runaway thing. It was like, it's similar to when we think about the number of groups that use feats and the number of groups that don't. It's just a simple majority, it's like just over the line of 50%. So in many ways, this is ending up where you and I talked about it probably would end up in one of our other videos when we were sort of prognosticating how might the Wildshape feedback go. And really where it's going is people love the texture and differences that are present among the different beast options in the 2014 Wildshape. But even the people who like that form of Wildshape are open to the feature being a bit easier to use. Because as you and I have discussed in a video about the Druid, making Wildshape easier to use, that's our main goal here.
Yeah.
We're not actually wedded to a specific implementation in terms of like the exact stat blocks that are being used. Our main goal is just simply we no longer want to be asking a brand new player or even a veteran player who's strapped for time to go ponder 100 stat blocks and decide which one they're going to turn into. And so that's what we will work on solving. And the next time the Druid appears in Unearthed Arcana, everyone is going to get to see an entirely different take when it comes to Wildshape that addresses the feedback that we got here. Now, in the Druid feedback, most of it was about Wildshape, but we did see some interesting commentary about other things that we were exploring in the Unearthed Arcana. One of those was people really liked the promise of channel nature, this idea of using what was formerly just uses of Wildshape for more than Wildshape, which is actually something we've already been doing in Druid design for a while. We, in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, had subclasses where the Druid could use Wildshape for something other than Wildshaping.
Yeah.
Channel nature is just that with a different name. But as much as people like the promise of channel nature, the feedback is they'd like to see us do more with it. I love that kind of feedback. If essentially the feedback is, we're not super happy with the version here, but we like it, so please give us more with the following feedback. We will absolutely do that. Now, the feedback on the Circle of the Moon Druid, very interesting feedback. Some of it I expected and some of it I didn't. I came to the feedback wondering, for instance, is there going to be a lot of requests for being able to turn into elementals again, since that was a function, just as one example, in the 2014 Circle of the Moon Druid. The piece that surprised me is that was not a major theme, but rather people wanted us to go a little further in the redesign to really lean into sort of the lunar aesthetic of the subclass. In other words, it was people wanting the subclass to be a bit more internally coherent. And also when it comes to Wildshape, desiring for the forms to be resilient, so that the Circle of the Moon Druid can continue to function in melee without being afraid of being squashed too easily. We hear that feedback. We will absolutely respond to it, while at the same time not bringing back the runaway power that the Circle of the Moon Druid could have at high levels in the 2014 version.
And what made that a runaway power?
So one of the main reasons is that at high level the Druid got unlimited uses of Wild Shape, which for the Circle of the Moon Druid meant unlimited hit point recharges, because every time you entered a new form, it meant you got all of the hit points of that form. But even before you got unlimited versions of Wild Shape, you had enough uses of Wild Shape and enough forms you could turn into with large hit point pools that it made it very difficult for dungeon masters to make Circle of the Moon Druids feel threatened in any way, because of this ability to just essentially hit the Wild Shape button and sometimes get more hit points than the Druid themselves had. And so that will be reined in however the Circle of the Moon subclass ends up, and as we go through the feedback. And that will be a common theme with some of the things that we do. We will absolutely incorporate as much feedback as we can, but there are going to be some places where things simply, the balance needs to be corrected. And this is one of those places. We talked when talking about the sorcerer, that like Twin Spell is an example of something that needed its power adjusted. What's cool is there aren't actually that many things like that. Most things power-wise are where we want them to be, and it's much more about finding ways in which we can make them even more fun, even more true to the identity of the class or subclass, and where possible, seeing how we can make them even easier to use.
Isn't necessarily applicable to the survey results, but you mentioned like you don't want a class to necessarily eat someone else's lunch. Like the Paladin, some people notice that maybe being able to smite with a ranged weapon kind of intruded on kind of the theme and feeling of the Ranger. Is that true for subclasses as well? Because we've got something like the Arcane Archer for fighters that's got a little bit like, okay, I'm a pretty good archer, I'm kind of in the range of a Ranger kind of.
So subclasses, by their very nature, are meant to give you either a taste of something that no class has, or they're meant to give you a taste of something that's in another class. So it's actually intentional in subclass design that occasionally a class, through that subclass, will get the feel of another class in the game. We don't do that with every subclass, but that absolutely is the goal with some of them. The main thing we don't want to do is have base classes that are eating too much of each other's lunches, even though there is a lot of shared tech and story among the classes. Like an example of this is we have multiple classes who have the fighting style feature, for instance, and it's appropriate for each of the classes that have it. But then we made sure that each of the classes that have that shared feature have other things that those classes alone have. For instance, of the classes that have the fighting style feature, only the Paladin has lay on hands.
Right.
Only the Hunter has, the Ranger, not the Hunter subclass, but the Ranger class. Only the Ranger class has their favored enemy mechanics.
And there's a little bit of history of also when you have Eldritch Knight, this is kind of like the fighter mage, and then you have Blade Singer, which is the fighter mage, but more mage than fighter.
Yep.
That kind of connective tissue between two, maybe even opposite classes.
Yeah, exactly. And those two are prime examples of a subclass that is intentionally giving you some of the feel of a class that is other than the one that contains that subclass. Yeah, because Eldritch Knight gives you a sampling of Wizard, and Blade Singer gives the Wizard a sampling of Fighter.